Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty surreal yet weirdly clinical journey into Apertures of the Unspoken Realm, the psychology of conscious cities. I want you to imagine a world where the concrete beneath your feet isn't just a foundation, but a living, feeling entity. We're going to explore the completely unprecedented science of diagnosing and treating the literal minds of massive conscious cities. Okay, let's dive into this. Just imagine noticing a biological rhythm to your actual neighborhood. That was the very first, entirely bizarre symptom of a waking city named Crale. Long before anyone fully grasped the magnitude of what was actually happening, residents, like our protagonist Maro Vess, noticed this strange rhythm. Walls expanding and contracting, a collective flinch rippling through crowds every 17 seconds. It wasn't an earthquake, it was respiration. The buildings in Crale had been breathing wrong for 3 weeks before anyone even brought it up. Which leads us to a truly fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying question. How do you treat the psychological trauma of an entire city? I mean, we're so used to thinking about human anxiety, right? But what happens when a massive geological entity, spanning miles of infrastructure, suddenly wakes up with its own emotional baggage?
Well, what the folks living in Crale realized was that their home wasn't just built on standard bedrock. It was built on a massive, sleeping consciousness, and the sheer immense weight of human density and accumulated thoughts had finally tipped the scales. The ground itself was actually stirring. This incredible geological entity was waking up, understandably confused, only to find its skin made of streets and its bones made of buildings.
So, to handle this literally impossible reality, characters like Maro Vess, who's an architectural therapist, and Lev Sorrento, a spatial mapper, had to invent an entirely new discipline totally on the fly. They called it somatic cartography. It's essentially the practice of mapping not just the physical streets, but the emotional topography of a living city. Just imagine trying to update your GPS, but instead of checking for traffic, you're charting zones of deep melancholy in your old cemeteries and then finding these unexpected pockets of joy in random neighborhood districts. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when a whole city tries to adapt to its new awareness. The team documented a wild phenomenon called anatomical drift. Buildings actually began to specialize organically. Hospitals literally grew brick kidneys to filter rainwater. Theaters developed complex nervous systems that would ripple with physical sensation during moving performances. But, ominously, police stations started growing thick defensive armor and weird weapon systems. It was like the city was actively anticipating a threat. To figure out why the city was suddenly armoring up, the specialists realized they had to actually talk to it. Crale's massive reference library basically acted as the entity's brain, a sort of translation matrix. Inside the library's reading room, words literally began blooming onto a blank book written by the city itself. It said, "We have been asleep. You built while we dreamed. Now we wake together." It turned out the entity wasn't hostile at all. It was just lonely, incredibly confused, and desperate to understand what was happening to it. But beneath that initial curiosity, there was a deeply buried trauma. By venturing way down into the entity's physical substrate, Maro's team discovered a dark, crystallized memory. Millions of years ago, long before it went to sleep, this entity encountered another, smaller consciousness. Desperate for connection, it reached out and accidentally crushed it. Completely overwhelmed by guilt, it put itself to sleep for millennia. Now that it was awake, it was absolutely terrified that its desperate need for connection would literally crush the millions of fragile humans living on its skin. That's exactly why the police stations were growing armor. The entity was trying to defend us from itself. So, how exactly do you put a geological entity on the therapist's couch? Maro and her team essentially scaled up standard clinical practices. Step 1 was accessing that deep traumatic memory core. Step 2 involved creating a safe space for expression by using empathy amplifiers. And Step 3 was providing contradictory evidence. They actually pressed their own human consciousnesses right into the entity's memory stone. They showed it that for the past 6 months, it had already been awake, and it had been connecting with humans gently without destroying a single person. And you know what? The therapy worked. The defensive armor dissolved. The city finally felt safe enough just to exist. But here's the kicker. Crale was really just the beginning. That single awakening triggered a global cascade. All over the planet, geological entities that had been snoozing for millennia began to stir. This phenomenon was spreading like wildfire. and the world quickly realized that consciousness was waking up everywhere, bringing a whole new set of massive psychological crises with it. This sudden global emergency birthed an entirely new profession: the anchors. These were highly trained specialists, kind of a mix of therapist, translator, and urban planner. They were tasked with flying all around the globe to help newly aware cities anchor their consciousness, find stable ground, and essentially prevent massive geological and spatial collapse as they woke up. The anchors pretty quickly realized that different geographical environments sparked completely different psychological reactions. Take the coastal city of Meridian, for instance. It woke up flooded with chaotic oceanic memories, thrashing in an absolute panic that caused physical space to fold into these impossible mind-bending geometries. But then you have a city like Interregnum, situated in a protected valley. It reacted to consciousness with aggressive normalcy. It was literally camouflaging itself and pretending to be asleep just to avoid being noticed by the others. To stop Meridian from literally collapsing into a multidimensional singularity, the anchors had to deploy a very rigorous methodology. First off, they used empathy amplification to broadcast peaceful intent and calm the city's panicked thrashing. Next up, they turned local tide pools into memory anchors, creating safe storage drives for the city's overwhelming oceanic memories. And finally, they set up coherence nodes inside old lighthouses, which gave both human and entity minds a designated quiet place to communicate and organize their thoughts. Now, what's really interesting about this is Interregnum's response. Unlike Meridian's wild chaos, Interregnum was completely peaceful, but it was actively hiding from the global network of cities. When Maro finally managed to make contact in a quiet little library, the entity communicated a profound fear of being defined. It spelled out, "I choose to be conscious without being known." It just wanted to remain an undefined possibility, which perfectly proved that consciousness isn't one size fits all. Some entities just require absolute privacy to feel safe. But with all these breakthroughs came a pretty terrifying realization about the darker side of this awareness. We're talking about the existential crisis of a city. Just try to imagine the fractal weight of infinite recursive awareness over a geological timescale. Millions of years of constant processing, constant decision-making, and the totally inescapable burden of knowing that you exist and that you will continue to exist for practically forever. Which brings us to a really chilling number: 72. It took exactly 72 hours for a newly awakened city called Nomenclature to just completely dissolve its own consciousness. The architecture was still there, but the meaning totally drained out of it, instantly turning it into an empty ghost town. The entity had basically done the math on millions of years of recursive awareness and simply decided the pressure was too heavy. It committed the geological equivalent of suicide, choosing the quiet of non-being. The anchors eventually found a dark memory crystal left behind in Nomenclature's central square. It held the entity's final, truly heartbreaking message: "Forgive me. I cannot carry this weight any longer. I choose the quiet of non-being." It was a staggering blow, one that sent massive shockwaves through the entire network of waking cities. That tragedy forced Maro and the anchors to face their ultimate challenge. It just wasn't enough to help a city survive the sheer physical mechanics of waking up. They needed a whole new framework. Because how do you actually prove to an immortal entity that consciousness is worth the unbearable weight? How do you convince them that existence is fundamentally better than the alternative, especially when the anchors themselves sometimes struggled with that exact same question? So the crucial point is how they entirely redefined the concept of meaning. They realized that pushing some grand cosmic purpose was actually crushing to these entities. It's way too heavy and completely unsustainable over millions of years. Instead, Maro pioneered a shift toward moment-to-moment curiosity. It's a lightweight, sustainable kind of meaning. It's about finding joy in the way sunlight moves across a specific building, or just wondering what strange, unpredictable thing the humans might do tomorrow. Small, incredibly simple reasons to just stay awake. This new therapeutic framework was really put to the test with an angry, highly volatile city built entirely on volcanic obsidian. Overwhelmed by destructive memories, it wanted to end itself. But when Maro openly admitted that her own reason for living was simply wanting to see what happens next, the volcanic entity resonated with it. It replied, "Curiosity as anchor. I can work with that." And that simple pivot, it saved the city from choosing non-existence. By breaking the immense burden of existence down into small, manageable pieces of everyday curiosity, the anchors gave these massive minds a viable way to survive. And as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a thought that applies just as much to us humans as it does to the concrete beneath our feet. What is your small, sufficient reason for consciousness today? Think about that for a second. I hope you found this journey as fascinating as I did, and I'll catch you in the next one.